Okay, so we're going to kick off post-flop by talking about small blind single raised pots. Now, in the past, in the pre-flop section, we looked at the database after we talked about ranges and theory and all that stuff. Here, I think it makes more sense to open with it, so I can show you about the different win rates on different board types and what kind of stats you should be aiming for, etc. Now, I do want to say that the stats I'm going to show you will be a little bit, I guess maybe a little bit misleading in that my pre-flop ranges from the small blind and the big blind were both much looser than my opponents. So really, if you can play a lot looser than your opponent pre-flop, and then when there is a flop, break about even, you're going to be crushing your opponent. So I looked at my win rates from the small blind and the big blind in single raised pots, and I think my net win rate from the two is like -1 BB per 100. But, I'm playing an extra 5, 10, 15% of hands pre-flop, which is definitely going to add up to being, essentially my whole edge. And it's not that the money was made pre-flop. The money was made post-flop. I just did more with shitty hands or like shittier range. So I want to show you across different textures here. I want to talk about some stats, and let's go from there. So first off, my flop c-bet ended up being 56, and my barrel was 56.60 over the course of the sample. Not a huge fan of this. I would have liked to see this maybe be a little bit lower and a little higher turn river barrel. I'm sure if we looked at maybe the last couple of years, it changes. Let's go since to the last 2 years. So last couple of years, it's a higher turn river barrel, I guess. But overall, ended up being a little lower than I would like to see. And the reason that this matters is because, when I look at my fold river probe, mine's definitely on the high side at 72. But the reason I'm okay with that is because I do try and barrel the turn at a high enough frequency to deny those low equity floats on the flop. Now, as your c-bet gets lower, like even into the 50s, with a river probe that's this high of a fold, your opponent can float you. But the thing is, they still have to, if they call the flop, they have to get through the turn, right? It has to go check, check, turn, which only happens 44%. And then, if it gets there, they will 100% get a great river bluff. But this 72, I will call 28. And when they're bluffing, I'm going to call more like 35. And that's actually one of the problems with the river fold stats in general. It doesn't take into account that when your opponent has a good hand, they are going to block the combinations of your calls. And when they're bluffing, they're not. So usually when you look at a river fold, you can kind of imagine that if they have it, your fold's going to be 5 to 10% lower. Sometimes even more than that, but 5 to 10% lower in general. And when they're bluffing, your call will be 5 or 10% higher. So, when you think about when they don't have it on the turn, I'm probably barreling more. When it does go check, check on the turn, I probably fold more like 60 or 65%. I think that this is actually going to do a pretty good job of not allowing those very low equity floats on the flop. However, you can see we do raise our barrel on each street. I would like to see maybe a little less flop c-betting, as I said before, but let's go ahead and take a look at some different textures. Also worth noting, as you play looser pre-flop, your win rate will go down. And as you play tighter, your win rate will go up, but not necessarily a good thing. All right, so let's look at ace-high flops. Okay, so ace-high flops didn't end up going that well compared to some other spots, which, it makes some sense to me that ace-high boards would not be that bad for the big blind, because even though they are 3-betting all of their very strong aces, they're still going to for sure flat all of the middling to weak offsuit ones. They have a lot of those, and those hands are never folding pre-flop, so big blind will definitely have a lot of aces in their range. One thing that I think in retrospect about the way I played this, I'm not a huge fan. Let's actually put success rates in here as well. I think that would be kind of interesting. So before we even look at it, I would generally anticipate on these boards they would have a higher fold to turn c-bet and a lower fold to river c-bet. But I guess it depends on the way they're floating, because on the turn, if you bet on an ace-high board, you're generally going to get called by ace-x or higher. It actually ended up being inverted on that. So 46% fold to flop bet, 43% turn bet, 50% river bet. And again, we're not going to use that to just base our whole strategy around. We're gonna start off in the same way we talked about before. Start with a low flop bet and trying to have a higher turn river bet. But what we can see from this is that bluffing in these spots tends to be quite good. We tend to have a high flop c-bet success, low turn c-bet success, and high river c-bet success. And maybe that's some of the reason why I decided to not bet the turn as much over the course of this sample. But I think there was definitely still more room to use higher bet frequencies. I will say on some of these boards, my river size ended up being very big. And we'll talk about overbetting on different runouts once we get a little more into individual hands and stuff. So that also could be playing a role here on the river fold. All right, let's take a look at king high boards. So the idea here is we're just going to give a run through for you guys on different boards, what you should be aiming to do in terms of c-bet by street and in terms of the opponent's high played, how they folded, etc. And we're seeing a pretty clear pattern here on these boards with a high card on them, that turn c-bet success ends up being a lot lower, whereas flop and river ends up being higher. And that kind of makes sense because we're looking at a static situation. So when you're looking at a static spot, it's going to end up being a situation where they have a lot of hands, just have to fold in the flop. And then on the turn, I guess they have a more clear-cut decision. So it's also kind of interesting. It's also interesting to me that the stats that I've played through these, while I might not recommend them as a good theoretical style, it has fairly directly countered the style of my opponent so far. So that's actually been pretty solid. I'll take a look at some queen high flops. All right, so here we're getting more kind of into the traditional style I would like to see. My win rate also is better here. So maybe I just didn't play ace and king high boards as correctly as I would have liked. And we're looking more like 51, 55, 60 barrel by street. And we're again seeing this turn thing, which is, it's so funny to me because, and we'll talk more about this when we're in the big blind, but I think the turn is the worst place to float because when you call on the turn, you don't get that many good bluff opportunities on the river. And additionally, you're so much more likely to face a river c-bet than you are a turn c-bet. So, not a big fan of that, but, you know, it is what it is. All right, let's look at jack and 10 high boards. Okay. Here we're starting to get into more of the style that I really like to play with the higher barrels. And as I'm looking through this, I'm like, wow, guys, I could have played better on ace and king high boards, but again, we see the same thing on the fold by street. Also, the win rate going up on these boards. One thing to note as well, your win rate, as boards become less static, your win rate should increase. So on the lower boards, your win rate should be, actually, let's go full screen and talk about this for a second. So on the lower boards, your win rate should actually be higher than the higher boards, with the exception of some of the Broadway boards where, you know, you can have the straights your opponent can't have. And the reason is because as equity is less defined, position has more value. So an extreme example, but let's say you c-bet on 6-5-4. Here, position is very valuable because if you have any hand in the small blind that chose to bet there, you're going to have top pair better by the river, you know, around a fifth of the time or a fourth of the time. So there's a lot of runouts you get to value bet. Meanwhile, in the big blind, you don't get to decide when you bet. That's the small blind's decision. So in that spot, the small blind gets to make way more, and that's why those low boards tend to have a much higher expected value for the small blind. The static boards, the paired boards, the ace high boards, those boards have less opportunity for the in-position player to take advantage of their position by betting when things become more favorable, so their win rate should be lower on those boards as well. Just an interesting thing to think about. All right, so let's look at like the 9 high and lower boards. Ended up being 22 big blind win rate. Oh, and you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, I went through a long phase where on the very low boards, I went with a 100% continuation bet strategy in order to try and get the most folds on those flops. And because I thought allowing my opponent to float on boards that were that low, it just really didn't end up being a very good strategy. Or sorry, betting all your hands on those low boards, it denied your opponent a lot of equity and takes advantage of the fact that, yeah, we do have an advantage here in the small blind. Now, ultimately, I changed the strategy. I thought betting 100% on the very low boards did not make as much sense as what I was doing. But, you know, and you can kind of see here where I'm talking about as far as the equity required on these boards. You're getting much lower success rate on each street, and I was using a much bigger size. So let's go ahead and let's change this back. Let's look at some paired boards. All right, so on paired boards, went a lot better for the small blind. But let's take a look at the high paired versus the low paired. Because I have a feeling that the low paired boards are going to end up being a decent chunk worse. Sorry, a decent chunk better. Okay, board cards, flop. All right, let's put with a Broadway card. On the Broadway flops, we're looking at a 37 BB win rate, which is actually pretty good. Higher than I would have thought. And the low ones, we're looking at more like a 56% BB win rate. So, paired boards, you know, it ended up actually going better for the small blind than I would have initially imagined. But I do think that on dynamic boards, there is more edge for the in-position player because of your ability to use your position on later streets. These did go surprisingly well, though, which is interesting to me. Maybe my strategy on those boards needed to be a bit different. And now let's do this. Let's look at a couple more board textures here really quick. Actually, let's go suits. Monotone boards. This is going to be a very small sample, so it's not going to say too much here. All right. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up here. So let's dive in and talk about some small blind single raise pot. Let's talk about some static board textures. And let's do a little bit of game tree analysis to talk about how we should be playing with both our bets on the flop and our checks back. Checks back.